The former Minister of Information in Zimbabwe, Jonathan Moyo, says the judiciary in that country must not make judgments based on the political climate. Moyo spoke to SABC News about the continued incarceration of a member of parliament, Job Sikhala. Moyo says the opposition is weak ahead of the presidential and parliamentary elections in Zimbabwe in August. He also defended the controversial Patriotic Bill recently passed by the Zimbabwe parliament. Opposition parties and human rights activists say the bill is aimed at silencing those who criticize the Zimbabwean government. SABC International News editor Sophie Mokoena compiled this report.
One can say without qualification is that things have changed in Zimbabwe radically. And you get a view that says in some respect things are worse than they were in what some people refer to as the Mugabe days and so forth. And you have others who say that things are certainly different, but even better compared to the Mugabe days. One thing that hasn't changed is that Zimbabwe continues to attract negative narratives. The Zimbabwe story continues to be told in the same ways, in some respect, as it used to be told when we were in Zimbabwe under the late President Mugabe. And in some other ways, the narrative is quite bleak. From where I sit, I see a Zimbabwe which has become depoliticized. I don't see the same Zimbabwe which was outspoken as a country in its participation in regional international affairs, as well as within its territory. Zimbabwe has become less outspoken. And then there are some things which are happening which raise quite some concern. I really have been profoundly concerned by the return of pre-trial detention. You know, you don't have to hold a brief for any politician to realize that even if it's one case, but a case of a member of parliament who gets arrested for saying things that may not have been palatable to the authorities, but saying them in his capacity as a lawyer on behalf of his murdered client, and then he gets detained for a year. It becomes a little bit, troubling. I'm talking about Job Sikhala.
Job Sikhala.
Yes. You know, Zimbabwe now has these extremes. On the one extreme, you have things which definitely were not happening during the Mugabe days, or certainly the latter days. You know, for example, or not even for example, but particularly this case of Job Sikhala. It's troubling.
Why is the situation deteriorating in terms of issues related to how you apply the laws of the country and justice in particular?
Yes. As a student of politics, I don't think that the custodian of justice, rule of law, are politicians anywhere in the world. If you were to leave American politicians to their own means, they will be jailing each other left, right, and center.
But there's a view that there are leaders who are abusing state resources.
No, I think I want to I want to make I hear where you're coming from, but I want to make an important explanation to highlight what I think is fundamentally wrong with Zimbabwe and what I think makes it different from even some neighboring countries. There is a reason why there is a separation of powers. There is a reason why there should be an independent judiciary. I think it is dangerous to expect politicians to be the custodians of justice and fairness. It's a fundamental institutional question. For you to have that, those who are entrusted with the interpretation of our laws, from the Constitution to our statutes, have an obligation to be true to their maybe calling, but certainly responsibility. It is troubling when you find yourself in a country where the judiciary plays to the whims of the political class.
Or the political environment.
Or even the political environment, indeed. And that is what is wrong in Zimbabwe. During the Guguraundi years, which were the darkest years in the history of our country, there was a judiciary which was faithful to its constitutional responsibility. The politicians will fight, trample on each other's rights, but the judiciary would do its job and discharge its responsibility by pronouncing things that were either illegal or unjust in terms of what they were. In this particular case, and in some way it appears isolated, but very pronounced. We had an unusual development where the magistrate courts and the High Court are acting in concert. In the past, it has been common to see quite strange and outrageous judgments coming from the magistrate court on political matters, and the High Court would do the right thing, but the legal or constitutional thing being the right thing, and not tolerate this. But for a person to be in detention for 1 year.
A lawmaker for that matter?
Yeah, I don't think that it speaks well of anyone of us as Zimbabweans, but in particular those who are in authority, then specifically of the judiciary. You don't want to be in a country where the courts become an extension of the politics of the day. This is what I think is a bit scary, alarming about the current developments, if you look at that. But there's another area. If you look at what has been happening in Zimbabwe, there are these contrasting developments. On the one hand, there is this quite shocking and complete collapse of judicial institutions. And for me, I really blame more the judiciary in the case of Honorable Job Scala than I do the politicians, because as I was suggesting, even the American politicians are wont to behave like that. That's why you must have an independent judiciary. But on the other hand, I look at the developments in Zimbabwe, I see that arguably, if you look at the last 23 years, the last 5 or 4 have seen for the first time a sustained focus on the infrastructural question. I mean, from the late 90s, we saw quite a systematic deterioration of infrastructure in Zimbabwe. And with the sanctions and all the other problems, the fiscus was no longer able to attend to things like clinics, building of clinics, hospitals, well, maybe not hospitals, but certainly clinics now, and roads, repairs, systematic kind of construction. It is happening, and I think it is encouraging to say that, but it is nowhere near what is actually required and certainly expected.
You were quite critical in relation to the leadership of President Mnangagwa. What has changed?
Well, I don't think that much has changed, except that the period that you are probably focusing on is the one that is the period that immediately followed the tragic events of 2017, and then
is it tragic events or a coup?
A coup is by definition tragic. Especially when it happens in a country like Zimbabwe at that time, which many people saw as, in spite of its problems, but as one of the most stable countries in the region, a country that was contributing to the security and stability of others. So, it didn't fall within expectations, but it was also unconstitutional, notwithstanding that there was some high court order which said it was lawful and so forth. And the impact it had. And then just this notion that if the political class has some disagreements, elements of it should resort to the means of violence to settle the disagreements. I think that was very unfortunate and, in my view, tragic. But it is a done deal. Wisdom is not about always making noise and crying that this has happened and it has displaced me, and continuously look at the political situation from the standpoint of your personal experience. So if in a way, if you ask what has changed, part of what has changed in terms of my articulation is that I actually had the opportunity with my colleague, Comrade Joao, last year on the 15th of November to put it in writing. We actually put it in writing in an open letter to ZANU-PF people to say what happened was that we reacted to that coup by painting everything and everyone in ZANU-PF with one brush.
Are you saying you are extending a hand of friendship and you are looking at reconciling with your party?
I'm not aware of any case in history where a victim has extended the hand of reconciliation to those who victimized the victim. If I were to extend such hand, which hand I don't have, I would make history and be the first one to have done that.
But I'm willing to go back to ZANU-PF and maybe perhaps even go back to Zim, particularly ahead of elections.
The possibility of me going back to Zimbabwe before 23 August 2023 is zero. It's not even in the cards. I certainly have reconciled myself first and foremost with what happened. You know, if you follow the discourse in Zimbabwe, you get people saying, oh, you were outsmarted, by which they mean guns outsmarted me. I can't imagine a situation where certainly myself, but from what I know, even those others of my colleagues who were caught up in this situation, the possibility of contemplating the use of violence to defend a political interest, even as we saw what was happening, was completely out of the question. There was no possibility of even thinking, why don't we invite a neighbor so-and-so and neighbor so-and-so, or why don't we advise the President Mugabe, that, you know, retaliate or come up with a strategy of inviting somebody else who has the instruments of violence to come and defend you. So that was completely out of the question. But in terms of your question, and based on our open letter to members of ZANU-PF, we would definitely, or in this case, let me speak for myself. I am definitely reconciled in terms of the situation of what happened, which means accept it. It's a fact. You know, it's a reality, and it creates a completely new situation. Two, realize that you were not fighting everyone. You did not have a conflict or a disagreement with everyone. You had a disagreement with some of your colleagues who are individuals. And frankly, from an institutional point of view, there are ZANU-PF individuals, but they are not ZANU-PF. ZANU-PF is larger.
Are you saying you're still a loyal believer, let me put it that way, of ZANU-PF as an organization, but not leadership?
No, I'm not that kind of an unrealistic person. I'm not sitting here talking to you as a member of ZANU-PF, but I'm definitely as nationalist as I would imagine are the generality members of ZANU-PF. I cannot imagine myself out of the nationalist roots which have historically defined ZANU-PF. And we made that point quite clear in the open letter.
But you supported Chamisa.
Yes, and we explained. There's, you know, even President Mugabe did, and that is an open question with an open answer.
What has changed now?
Well, I also explained, or we explained this in our open letter. I think certain experiences happen whose result is to bring to the fore either fundamental differences and or contradictions, or bring to the fore a platform or possibility of the meeting of minds. Events that have happened since the 2018 election, but for me, even 2 or 3 years after, because I continued to work with Chamisa, it made it possible for us, and me, I've verbalized it, written about it, but I also know he has talked about it with his people and so forth, that there was really no fundamental consensus, shared vision. There was just an opportunity of convenience. And in a way, I should have understood this better, because after all, Chamisa and others in his political circle were part of the November 2017 coup. So in the end, a situation was created that they were less engaged, even less critical than we were. If you go back and you review, we were more critical of what had happened than they were. Why? Because they were part of it. And then they saw us, and we're happy with that situation, playing a role of backing dogs to say, go and fight them and so forth. You are the one who is, to use their term, bitter, and are concerned about what happened than we were.
Now,
So at some point, sooner or later, the reality hit everyone that my institutional home is the one that went on fire, and there will be no resolution of this matter unless everyone comes to terms with what actually happened.
your views about the coming election?
If you look at this election against the background of previous elections since, let's say, 2000, over the last 23 years, this is the one election without an opposition. The one situation we have in Zimbabwe today, and it has been developing since the last election, is that there is a palpable absence of an organized, discernible, active opposition. It is common cause that the leading opposition since 2000, which was in the form of the Movement for Democratic Change, MDC, is no longer there. And what there is in Zimbabwe today is an opaque movement which calls itself a Citizen Coalition for Change that is led by Advocate Nelson Chamisa. It is conspicuous by its absence in the political arena. And the elections right around the corner as we speak, scheduled for the 23rd of August, but there's no opposition. And even as we speak, you have a group of people who call, if we can call them that, who said they have formed a new political party in January of 2022. But even as we sit now, they have not launched that. This thing that is supposed to have been formed in January 2022 has only 4 visible officials. One who is the leader, whose title is not known, whether it's the president or change champion in chief or whatever. And then he has 2 spokespersons, a spokesperson and head deputy to make 3. And then he has a national organizing secretary who is the one that never speaks out of these three. Only these three speak for the movement. And they have officially said their engagement with the authorities and with the public is through some strategy they say is called strategic ambiguity. They say what they don't mean what they don't say, and a general election is right around the corner. So one thing that then has happened, which is a very dangerous thing that can trigger all sorts of chaos, is that the general thinking is the manifesto of the inactive opposition is a deteriorating economy, a collapsing economy, and the more the average person, be they consumer or a peasant farmer there, feels the pinch and suffers from a collapsing economy, they are going to vote for an opposition. When you are in a situation like that, you are in a very dangerous waters. And this is what is happening in Zimbabwe at the moment. In the past, you could tell what the contentious issues of the day, you could see some kind of manifesto issues, a contest, a political contest. The political contest in this election is not obvious. And for me, that is a matter of concern. And that is why I must add, our neighbors don't understand this, but yet it is a major feature, and it has always been there since 2000, but it has become much more pronounced in Zimbabwe now. And this is this feature. Unlike in Zambia, which has gone through a number of changes of government, unlike Malawi, unlike Kenya, and I would say even unlike South Africa, especially unlike South Africa. The one thing that is unfortunate, which has defined opposition in Zimbabwe, is that that space has been occupied by people who think that their battles have a better or realistic chance of success if they are supported by outsiders, and not just outsiders, but Western outsiders. And so you will find that the current crop of the opposition is very loquacious and active when it is speaking to those audiences outside, even when it is there. And this has come to define opposition politics in Zimbabwe. You know, in South Africa, you have the Musi Maimanes of this world who seem to internalize, regurgitate Western orientation views and so forth. But I have never seen or heard Musi Maimane speaking from Washington or London or Geneva denouncing things in South Africa. I always see him making noise and talking in South Africa, engaging his colleagues in South Africa, even though his views are quite westernized, if you want to call it. Certainly, it's impossible, beyond imagination, that you could have someone like Malema going to Geneva, Washington, and so forth to denounce Ramaphosa. You cannot even imagine Malema going to Havana or to Moscow to do that. The Zambians who have changed their societies have no history of doing that. In fact, just about every change of government that has taken place in Zambia has been influenced by Kenneth Kaunda's thinking, humanism, one Zambia, one nation. The same in Malawi, the same in Kenya. The changes that have taken place have been out of internal nationalist politics. But in Zimbabwe, you get people who think that it is important to speak to the world by taking platforms out there, and not in African countries. It's not like they will come and talk to their colleagues, solidarity with the opposition in South Africa and this. They go there, and that triggers a certain obvious, predictable reaction from the authorities. And it is a problem. It is particularly pronounced now.
The very same authority is also critical to, for example, the media on the continent.
If you look at the examples that I've mentioned, especially if you look at the experience of a country like Kenya, the Moyo days were very difficult days, but they are the days that produced a nationalist opposition. They were very difficult. They are instructive if you look at those years. And sometimes we've got to unpack the situation in order to really understand where its shortcomings are. You know, if you have, as we do in Zimbabwe, politicians who are in the opposition who don't do, I want to go back to the Maimane example. You will find Musa Maimane going to, and I'm using him because ideologically I don't agree with him, but he will go to communities who are having water problems, address them, make connections with those problems and the need to solve them locally, the local authorities, the provincial, the national, and so forth. In Zimbabwe, the most vocal opposition politicians are never seen in communities like out there, communities like Mzarabani, Wonde Valley, Cholocho. You will see them at press centers, or you will see them in Geneva. But you will not see them with the communities. And I'm suggesting to you that although we have seen elements of this situation in the recent past being the last 23 years, the last 3-4 years are so pronounced in that regard. And that's why you can't have everyone's opposition, where everyone is participating to solve the issues that directly affect the lives and the livelihoods of communities. And for me, it is really an issue of concern because it's not as if Zimbabwe has never had a homegrown, indigenous, nationalist opposition. That's what ZAPU was between 1980 and 1987. That's what Zoom of Edgar Tekere was in 1990. That's what the Forum for Democracy of the late Chief Justice Dumbuchena was. And one would have thought that with that background and even the recent experience of the last 23 years, but in particular what happened in 2017 and so forth, you would have thought that the opposition in Zimbabwe would come of age. First and foremost, inspired by the nationalist tradition, just like EFF is.
There has been an outcry with the recently introduced Patriotic Bill. What is your view?
First of all, we hear people saying that it's an act, like the way you are saying, when it's not an act yet. An act is a law that has been assented to by the president and gazetted, promulgated as a law. This one hasn't. Then you have other people who say that this is a bill. and they've named it a Patriotic Bill, or Patriot, to sort of approximate to the American thing. It's not. But what we in fact have, and then, by the way, there are some who say this is this so-called Act Bill, Patriotic, is designed.
What is this thing?
Is designed. Some things you have to define them in terms of what they are not, in order for us to understand what they are. It is not a law. It is not a bill. It is not about outlawing or disallowing criticism of the government of the day. It is a clause 5 of a bill that is amending the Criminal Law Codification and Reform Act. So it is a bill that is amending the criminal code, and it is dealing with one thing, which it frames in the following words: willfully injuring Zimbabwe's sovereignty or national interest. It proposes to make it a crime for Zimbabwean citizens and or residents to willfully injure the sovereignty of Zimbabwe, or willfully injure the national interest of Zimbabwe. And in particular, it is about addressing a mischief of Zimbabwean citizens or residents working with foreigners, not among themselves, but working with foreigners to seek to overthrow the government, working with foreigners to seek to have those foreign countries impose sanctions on Zimbabwe or something. It is about that. It is not dealing with any mischief you find in our neighboring countries. I am not aware of South Africans who are in politics or in civic society who work with foreigners, although occasionally the DA people come pretty close to that in some cases. But I will have a tough time, and probably it will be impossible for me to sustain an example of even the DA working to say, okay, you Britons, you Americans, let's see, how can we get this ANC government? I see the DA going to PA, going to IFP, and so forth to say, can we, which to me is sensible. I assure you, there is a mischief which is uniquely Zimbabwean and in Zimbabwean politics that somehow compatriots end up saying, I'm better off if I go and talk to the US Senate and tell them that Zimbabwe is doing ABC, take measures. ZANU-PF is a product of Zimbabweans working in cahoots with the Americans to impose sanctions. And then our colleagues will say, you are giving us powers that we don't have. You think we can get... And yet the Americans, on the other hand, they don't want to be seen to be waking up on their own and say, we are taking this law. When they argue in their Congress why they've taken ZANU-PF, they say, we have been asked to do this. We've been approached to do this, and they produce volumes and volumes of compatriots making representations about their situation in Zimbabwe. I just think, no matter how difficult an internal situation can be, the idea of people then going out there to seek support, to work in cahoots, it really should not come to a point where there's a feeling of coming up with a law. And I understand why colleagues in neighboring countries like South Africa, Zambia, Malawi, and so forth, Mozambique, they don't understand this because in their countries, no one does that. No one does that. These oppositions that have been successful in the region are homegrown nationalist oppositions. It's difficult to fault them because they are coming from the same fountain, speaking the same language with those they seek to depose. And this is the difference. So this thing is not doing what it is alleged to do. It seeks to deal with this unique mischief you don't find in any country, but you find in Zimbabwe. And I understand why others elsewhere, they don't understand. Why should it become necessary to come up with this law? Well, yeah, you will not understand it because your political opposition doesn't behave like that. In fact, in a number of these countries, the opposition is more nationalist than the ruling parties.